All right, this slideshow is the second on chapter 13, and we're going to focus on three endocrine glands. These are three examples of endocrine glands, some more important than the others, but together we're going to talk about the hormones that they secrete and the activities they control and how the glands themselves are controlled. So we're going to talk about the pituitary gland, which is in the cranial cavity up there. Actually, it's kind of two glands. And then we'll talk about the pancreas in the abdominal pelvic cavity. And then we'll talk about the ovaries and the testes, which are the reproductive glands. And so we're going to go over each of these three glands, kind of the structure, the function, and talk about what they do. So the pituitary gland is a very, very important gland. It's located in the cranial cavity just below the brain and actually linked to the brain by a short stalk. It's linked to the hypothalamus, which is that's homeostatic center that controls body temperature and another of other important functions. And the pituitary gland is often called the master gland because it actually controls other glands as well as some very, very important functions. And so in the picture there on the right, there's a little box around the pituitary gland just below the brain. And then that's expanded to show the relationship between the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, a very small area at the base of the brain. Okay, so let's talk about the pituitary gland. First, we'll talk about the anterior part of this. The anterior part of the pituitary gland is made up of epithelial tissue, and it has a blood vessel in it that links it to the hypothalamus. This blood vessel carries blood directly from the hypothalamus right to the pituitary gland, and so that blood goes nowhere else first, and it delivers actually what are called releasing hormones and release inhibiting hormones. It delivers those hormones from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland. And the anterior pituitary gland, under the control of these releasing hormones from the hypothalamus, itself releases 6 hormones: growth hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin, among others, but those are the ones we're just going to mention. These are very, very important hormones. Growth hormone determines the rate of growth and the way the cells use energy for almost all cells in the body. Its target tissues are found everywhere. Most cells have receptors for growth hormone. On the other hand, adrenocorticotropic hormone, that's very different. That's a hormone that controls a part of the adrenal gland. It's controlling the release of cortisol, a stress hormone. And so that hormone has a very specific target tissue. Likewise, thyroid stimulating hormone controls the thyroid gland and the hormones released by the thyroid gland. So again, here there's this anterior pituitary gland controlling another gland. So that's one of the reasons why they call it the master gland. Then a couple other hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, are responsible for stimulating activity in both the female and the male reproductive organs. Okay, and that will cause the development of the sex cells in males and females and the release of male and female sex hormones. Prolactin promotes development of the breast and the production of milk. So again, all these hormones are controlled by hormones released by the hypothalamus. So neurosecretory cells, basically neurons that look like epithelial cells, secrete hormones right into that blood vessel that then carries the hormones right to the anterior pituitary gland. So this is controlling some really, really major activities. Okay, then on the other side of the pituitary gland, there is the posterior pituitary gland. And in this case, instead of hormones being released by the hypothalamus, there are nerve cells, neurons, that link the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary gland, and these neurons can directly stimulate the posterior pituitary gland to release their hormones. So it's an impulse that comes from the hypothalamus, and there are two hormones produced by the posterior pituitary gland: oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin is a hormone that's involved in social interactions in both males and females. It's responsible for the contractions of the uterus that will be necessary in the birth process. It's also involved in the release of milk from the mammary glands during breastfeeding. And it can elevate blood pressure a little bit. It has another name called vasopressin, and so sometimes it's used to do that. Antidiuretic hormone, ADH, on the other hand, that hormone is released by the posterior pituitary gland, and it affects water balance by causing the kidneys to conserve water. And so that's a very important effect. And in fact, the hypothalamus is a center for water balance in our thirst center. And so the posterior pituitary gland is really involved in that homeostatic mechanism. Okay, the next gland we're going to talk about is the pancreas. The pancreas is located in the abdominal pelvic cavity. It's a structure that has two really distinct functions. Part of it is a digestive gland. It secretes buffers and enzymes that are needed for the process of digestion. But other parts of the gland secrete hormones into the blood. And these hormones are involved in controlling the most important nutrient in the blood. That's glucose. It's a sugar. Okay, and so these two hormones are insulin and glucagon. It releases another hormone called somatostatin, but we won't talk about it there. And so here I've got a little diagram of the negative feedback systems that control blood glucose, and the pancreas serves as the control center. So whenever glucose levels get high, which is up there, it says high blood sugar, the pancreas detects that, and it promotes the release of insulin. Okay, insulin is going to stimulate glucose uptake from the blood by the tissues. These include muscle tissues, fat cells, and so that will start to lower the amount of glucose in the blood. And then the other thing insulin does is it causes the liver to take the glucose and convert it into glycogen, which is basically just a storage form. Okay, and so those things are all going to lower blood sugar. If blood sugar is too low, that's shown in the bottom and in green, that's going to cause the pancreas to release a different hormone. That's called glucagon. Okay, when glucagon's released, that's going to, first of all, it turns off the signal that cells get from insulin to use sugar, and so the cells will start using other sources of nutrients like fatty acids and proteins. And glucagon, one of its big things it's going to do is it's going to cause the liver to start converting glycogen into glucose and releasing glucose into the blood. And so glucose levels should rise back to normal. So this is a really important negative feedback system, and here the control center is the pancreas, and it's coordinating activities in the liver, in fat cells, in muscle cells, all over the body. Okay. Then the last glands we're going to look at are the reproductive glands, the ovaries in females and the testes in the males. And so for the male, the male is going to produce in their testes a hormone called testosterone. Females, it's a little more complicated. Females are going to produce estrogen and progesterone, two hormones from the ovaries. And in both cases here, the control of this is really through the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus produces a releasing hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone. That's abbreviated as GnRH. And when that's released by the hypothalamus, it travels to the anterior pituitary, and that produces follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. Those are released into the blood by the pituitary gland, and they will travel through the blood to the testes. And both hormones are needed for the testes to produce testosterone. Okay, in both the male and female reproductive hormones, the sex hormones are responsible for the development of male or female anatomy. later, and that means they're secreted before a baby is born, early on as the fetus is developing. Then later, these will be secreted in high amounts during the teenage years, during puberty, and that will cause sexual maturation. And then these hormones are going to be secreted when the subject is an adult, and they will maintain the reproductive anatomy and reproductive processes that are needed to produce sperm and egg. In addition, many other tissues have receptors for the sex hormones, whether they're testosterone or estrogen. And this is what causes the secondary sex characteristics, the patterns of hair growth that we associate with maleness and femaleness, patterns of fat storage, muscle development, bone growth and bone mass, development of cartilage that produces things like a large voice box and things like that. These are also characteristics of the sex hormones. Okay, so to summarize, we've talked about three glands: the pituitary, the pancreas, the ovaries, and the testes. We kind of described the gland, how it's controlled, what hormones it's producing, and how the hormones are affecting the body. Okay, we'll stop there, and then we'll have one more little program about diabetes and endocrine disruptors.